I think that in today's world, where there is so much ugliness, perhaps the answer is museum, yes or no. Is the museum, which does in its own way provide an island of beauty? The answer is yes. The museum doesn't. The answer is no. But you may feel this is an oversimplification, and I'm willing to leave it at that. I should be most interesting to know what sort of questions my talk to you today has produced. Thank you very much. This is a contribution to a discussion at a workshop. It's not a lecture, and what I'm saying is merely a group of ideas that I'm throwing into the general pool. Now, some years ago, I wrote a book called Museums of Influence, and what I did was to look at museums, the development of museums over about the last 200 years, say since the French Revolution. And I tried to find out who had been the real pioneers, the museums which had contributed something new to the general stock of museum thinking. And I discovered there were 137 of them across the world, which isn't really very many when you consider the number of thousands of museums there are. And what I found was that the real pioneers, the fact that they were pioneers, is very quickly forgotten. They will put some ideas into the stock, the common stock, and then the other people will take them up, adapt them, use them for their own purposes, and then the pioneers are forgotten. Now, what was perhaps more interesting from the point of view of this workshop was that these museums were none of them very large museums. They were middle-sized museums, and I developed the idea that when you have new ideas in museums, these ideas normally come from museums of modest size. They don't come from the giants, nor do they come from the absolute pygmies, but they come from the ones in the middle. And I think what we should do before we go any further with this idea is to decide what is a small museum, what is a big museum. How do you measure the size of a museum? Do you measure it by the number of square meters of exhibition space? Do you measure it by the income of the museum? Do you measure it by the number of visitors he has in the year? How do you measure it? What is a big museum? What is a small museum? Now, we know, most of us, what a big museum is, a really big one. It's a museum with about 1 million visitors a year. And all the European countries have got 2 or 3 museums of about that size. They're not common. The average museum in Europe employs not more than 10 people, and many of those are probably volunteers. And it doesn't have a big income, in the same way that the typical railway station in any country isn't the big one in the capital city, the terminus. There's the small provincial museums, which are the typical ones. So that the ideas come from the smaller museums. Now, if we try and put some numbers to this, the number of museums, as I said, with 1 million visitors a year is very small. There's about 3 in France, there's 3 in England, and so it goes on. There's only 1 in Holland. And the numbers are going up, of course, because museums are getting more ambitious, but they're not going up to a large extent. Now, I wanted to suggest to you that when I talk about measuring a museum, it's rather like saying, as they did in the 18th century, that someone was a 1-bottle man or a 2-bottle man. The number of bottles that he could drink of wine at a sitting was the man. So you had a 2-bottle man, a 1-bottle man, and in some cases a 3-bottle man. And I think probably with museums it's something like that. The typical museum for Europe, and remember we've got something like 250,000 museums in Europe. The typical museum probably doesn't have more than about 50,000 visitors a year. That's the typical one. Now 50,000 a year is not more ever during even the busy months of the year than about 150 a day. And if you have a museum with 150 visitors a day, then there are times of the year and times of the day when there's nobody in the museum at all. You don't get the impression of being a busy place in any way. Now, how does a small museum of that size remain viable? How does it remain economic? Well, it's rather like, is a public library economic? It's rather like, is a school economic? A museum can be an investment on the part of a local authority, of a city, a municipality, of a county, of a region, in which case it's not required to be economic in the same sense that a business has. Museums don't normally go bankrupt, or they haven't done, but the pressure is on them more and more to be economically viable, and that is precisely what presents the problem. Because in order to attract more money, they must attract more people. And in order to attract more people, they must all the time have new ideas to put forward, new things that are interesting. And I wanted to give you the example of two museums, one at the big end and one at the small end, to show you what I mean. At the big end, there is the Northern Animal Park, the Noorderdieren at Emmen in the Netherlands. And that museum has had as many as 2 million paying visitors a year. It's a lot of people. And it does that by always having new exhibitions, by having a great variety of exhibitions. They have, for example, a zoo as part of the museum. And the zoo has got 14 elephants, and 14 elephants is a lot of elephants. And it also spends a lot of money on new design. It invests all the time in order to make money. So that people will come to this museum for a day out. They'll bring the family. There are several restaurants and cafes on the museum site, and people walk around and they'll come in order to have a day out, and partly to get their money back. But the small museum can't do that. If you've got only a maximum, say, of 150 to 200 visitors a day at the busiest season, it isn't economic for you to run a cafe or a restaurant. It isn't economic for you to pour money into new exhibitions. And yet, without new ideas, you can't attract people. And you might like to consider why people go to museums anyway. If you're on holiday and you're touring a new area, you will normally go to the museum as a matter of course. You want to see whatever the place has got to offer. And you are not likely to spend more than about an hour inside it. If it has a cafe and if it has a shop, you may spend as much as 2 hours inside. But the human flesh and blood can't stand walking around in a museum for much more than about an hour and doesn't want to do it. Now, the other museum I was thinking about, the Noorderdieren Park being the big one, is the Museum of David d'Angers at Angers in France. David d'Angers was a monumental sculptor in the 19th century who did big public monuments. And he gave to his hometown his plaster models from which he made the stone sculptures. And the museum has inherited these plaster models, so it's got, in a sense, nearly everything that David d'Angers ever made, but it hasn't got the originals. And it's put these, arranged them very well in the museum in a very dramatic way. And it's also got his notebooks, his diaries, his letters, all about his life, so that you can spend a very pleasant hour wandering around this museum without getting bored and without getting tired. But you can't do that in a great many museums. And in fact, if I talk about the 2-hour museum, it's going to be very rare that that museum is going to be a museum without a cafe and a shop. That these are part of the package which you buy, and you've got to have something as attractive as that in order to keep people interested. I think it's worth taking another line on this, because people who visit museums are either volunteers or conscripts. The conscripts come in school groups. They come whether they want to come or not. Usually they do want to come because they're changed from school. But the school says you go, and they go in groups, and they are given sort of lessons in the museum. These are conscripts. The people who go voluntary, which are mostly adults or adults with children, go of their own free will. Now, it's quite different to have a group of school children for 2 hours in a museum, to teach them in the museum, and to take a group of volunteers or a family of volunteers or one volunteer and interest that person in what you've got to offer. It's very difficult to do it. And unfortunately, it's true that the pressure on museums to get more and more visitors is increasing all the time. The grants from municipalities particularly are going down. Not enough museum money is going into museums all over Europe, and museums are in a very difficult economic position. Some are doing better than others, but some are in very great difficulties, and if they were businesses, as I said before, they would almost certainly by now be bankrupt. It's possible that we may be going to see a decline in the total number of museums for this very reason. There's many museums which can only continue on the basis of a lot of volunteers. They will have 1 or 2 paid staff, and who are expensive incidentally, and if you're only going to get 150 visitors a day and they all pay, then much of what they give into the museum in the way of money is going to go in the way of salaries, and you won't have very much left for anything else. I'm not trying to be despondent, I'm not trying to be pessimistic about this, but what I am saying is that you've got 2 completely different forces. On the one hand, you've got this small museum, the smaller museum, shall we say, anything from 50,000 up to 100,000 visitors a year. And this museum has got to have, it must live on ideas. If it doesn't have ideas, then it can't get people coming. Some of the smaller museums have got an almost automatic visitorship, if I can use that word. If it's the house where Van Gogh lived, or if it's the laboratory where Pasteur used to work, then it's got a romantic quality. And the fact that you don't do anything particular doesn't matter, because people will come when they're on tour in order to see this as a sort of little shrine. But if you haven't got that, if you've got the ordinary municipal museum, how are you going to persuade more people to visit it? And the only thing you can do is to constantly be having special exhibitions. And special exhibitions are expensive. They're expensive of staff time to arrange them. They're expensive of money to pay for the design work. And you can't simply say, we will have a special exhibition. You've got to find the money to do it. I've been very impressed going around Europe's museums, and I'm bound to admit that I prefer the small museum, by the amount of ingenuity that is put into the development of small exhibitions. With very little money at all, people manage to take things out of the store and produce a new exhibition out of almost nothing. And they do it by sheer expenditure of time and effort on the part of the staff. What I want to do, because this is a workshop, is to say that I believe very strongly that what I said in my book, Museums of Influence, remains true, that new ideas come into the museum field from the smaller museums. They don't come from the big museums, and they don't come to the big museums for a very good reason. If you have a museum like the Musée du Louvre or the British Museum, they will of course put on new exhibitions, but because they spend so much on them, they can't afford to experiment, and they can't afford to let these exhibitions fail. They must succeed, and that means that they're bound to be conservative, so that if you have in an art museum, this applies particularly to art museums, you will find that they will go for safe things. They'll go for paintings of the Italian Renaissance. They'll go for a retrospective exhibition on Van Gogh. They'll go for an exhibition on Cézanne. But they know that these are going to attract people. They know they're going to be safe. And they will not experiment with extraordinary things that they don't know whether they're going to work or whether they're not. The small museum, because its exhibitions cost less, can afford to take risks. And I think that's the thing to remember about the small museum, that not only has it got to take risks, because it must have successes, but it's in a position to take risks because it doesn't spend so much on any individual exhibition. I'm quite sure that all of you in the group today, in the workshop group, will say as I'm talking to you, yes, that represents our position exactly, or that doesn't represent our position. Now, if you have a big sponsor for a museum, supposing it's a commercial firm, then you're not under the same pressure to make experiments and to attract visitors. But there are fewer and fewer small museums in that situation. It's a great pity, because the golden days of sponsorship are passing. You will get sponsorship if you're a big museum for a big blockbuster exhibition. You'll get commercial sponsorship. But to get sponsorship for small exhibitions in small museums is very difficult and is now becoming almost impossible. I'm not saying that the future of the small museum is impossible. It isn't. But what I am saying is that fewer and fewer museums are going to be able to depend on paid staff. As a result of what I've been saying to you, is not to take it all, as I said, for gospel, but to say that what he's been saying does or doesn't apply to our museum, and to use this as a way of stirring up a little more discussion. Because I have visited in the last 20 years something like 1,000 new museums across Europe, which is a lot. And most of these have been museums attracting not more than 100,000 people. So that I have an experience of museums which does tell me that museums are going to continue to grow and to multiply. We're not going to see the end of new museums, but it's a biological process. And what I want to see is some museums die, they deserve to die, in order to make way for new ones, because it is the biological process of death and birth. You shouldn't have all death and you shouldn't have all birth. If it's all birth and no death, there isn't enough room on the ground. Because if you think about it, and I'll make this my last word, if you think about this, it's almost impossible, as I said earlier, to spend more than 1 hour in a museum that doesn't have a shop or doesn't have a cafe without getting very tired. You want someone to sit down, you want someone to rest.